In 1952, a change in how children were fed entered the nation's schools without announcement. It became the unremarkable routine of the cafeteria. The effects of this new normal would not appear for years. This was one quiet shift in a pattern that was repeating elsewhere. What replaced the older model of school meals, meals that had been cooked on-site from ingredients recognizable to anyone who had worked in a kitchen, was a system built for volume, for efficiency, for scale. And it was introduced at a moment when few people had the language or the inclination to resist it. The timing mattered. Post-war America was reorganizing itself around industrialization, around the promise that science and production could solve problems that had once seemed intractable. Hunger, for one. Inconsistency, for another. The idea that every child, regardless of geography or income, could receive the same meal, prepared the same way, delivered at the same cost, was appealing. It sounded like progress. And in many ways it was presented as such. But what wasn't discussed, what didn't make it into the press releases or the policy documents, was what would be lost in that exchange. Before this shift, school meals were largely prepared in individual school kitchens. There were cooks. There were recipes passed down or adapted locally. There was waste, certainly. There was inconsistency. Some schools served better food than others. Some had more resources. Some had none at all. But the food itself, when it was made from components. Vegetables were peeled. Meat was trimmed. Sauces were mixed. It was labor-intensive. It required trained staff. It required time. And as the country moved toward centralizing production, toward making systems leaner and faster, that model began to seem inefficient, outdated, expensive. The National School Lunch Program had been established in 1946, but its early years were still rooted in local preparation. By the early 1950s, however, the infrastructure was in place to begin shifting toward pre-packaged, pre-processed components. Meals that could be prepared in large facilities, frozen or shelf-stabilized, and distributed to schools where they would only need to be reheated. This wasn't framed as a compromise, it was framed as modernization. The language used was about equity, about ensuring that no child went hungry, about meeting nutritional guidelines that were, at the time, focused primarily on caloric intake and basic vitamin content. The deeper implications, what it meant to feed millions of children food that had been engineered for storage rather than taste, for cost rather than variety, those implications weren't part of the public conversation. Most people didn't question it. Parents trusted that the government, that schools, that the institutions responsible for their children's well-being were making informed decisions. There was an assumption, one that had been cultivated carefully throughout the mid-century, that industrial production was synonymous with safety, with improvement. That if something was mass-produced, it must have been tested, vetted, optimized. And in many cases, it had been. But optimized for what, exactly, was less clear. Children began eating meals that looked different from what their parents had grown up with. Meals that arrived in compartmentalized trays. Meals where the components didn't touch, didn't mix, didn't require any interaction. A rectangular pizza, a beige square of something called Salisbury steak, peas that had been frozen, then thawed, then reheated, potatoes that came as flakes, reconstituted with water, milk in small cartons, shelf-stable until opened, desserts that were individually wrapped, uniform in size, identical in taste regardless of which school, which state, which year they were served. This wasn't seen as a problem. It was routine. It was what school lunch was. And because it became routine so quickly, because it was rolled out across the country in a relatively short span of time, there was no reference point for comparison. For children entering school in the late 1950s, this was simply how food was served. They had no memory of anything different. And their parents, many of whom had grown up during the Depression or the war years, were often relieved that their children were being fed at all. The idea of critiquing the quality, the content, the long-term implications of that food, it didn't feel urgent. It felt ungrateful. Most people never noticed this at the time. Or if they did notice, they didn't have the framework to articulate what was wrong, because nothing was explicitly wrong. The meals met federal nutritional standards. They contained the required vitamins. They provided enough calories. On paper, they worked. And in a culture that was increasingly oriented around data, around measurable outcomes, around the idea that if something could be quantified, it could be controlled, that was enough. But what wasn't being measured, what couldn't easily be measured, was what these meals were teaching. Because food is never just fuel. It's education, it's culture. It's a set of signals about what matters, about what's normal, about what the body should expect. And when you feed a child the same textures, the same flavors, the same colors, day after day, year after year, you're not just feeding them, you're training them, you're shaping their palate. You're establishing a baseline for what food is supposed to be. And that baseline, for millions of American children, became industrial, became processed, became uniform. This didn't happen in a vacuum. The shift in school meals mirrored a broader shift in the American food system. Supermarkets were replacing corner grocers, prepackaged goods were replacing bulk ingredients. Convenience was being sold not as a luxury, but as a necessity. The post-war kitchen was supposed to be efficient, clean, modern. And modern meant less time spent cooking, less mess, less skill required. The same logic that made TV dinners appealing made processed school lunches seem inevitable. Why would schools resist a trend that families were embracing? But there was a difference. Families, at least in theory, had a choice. They could buy fresh vegetables if they wanted to. They could cook from scratch if they had the time. They could opt out of the industrial food system, even if only partially, even if only occasionally. Children in school had no such option. They ate what was served. And what was served was decided not by parents, not by local communities, but by federal contracts, by large-scale food suppliers, by companies whose primary concern was cost per unit, not flavor, not nutrition in any meaningful long-term sense, not the development of healthy eating habits. The real impact appeared years later, not immediately, not in any way that could be traced back cleanly to a single policy change or a single decision, but slowly, in patterns that took decades to become visible. By the time researchers began studying the effects of ultra-processed foods, by the time public health experts started connecting early dietary exposure to later metabolic outcomes, entire generations had already grown up on this food. Habits were set, preferences were entrenched. The idea that school lunch could taste good, could involve fresh ingredients, could be something other than what it had become, that idea felt distant, idealistic, impractical. And in the meantime, the system had only deepened. The contracts had grown larger, the suppliers had consolidated, the infrastructure had been built around a model that assumed food should be cheap, shelf-stable, and scalable. Shifting away from that model, even when the evidence began to suggest it might be worth reconsidering, required dismantling decades of embedded practice. It required challenging assumptions that had become so normalized they were invisible. Because that's what normalization does. It makes the constructed feel natural. It makes the chosen feel inevitable. And when something is normalized early enough, when it's introduced at a developmental stage, it doesn't feel like an imposition, it feels like reality. Children who grew up eating these meals didn't think of them as processed or industrial. They thought of them as school lunch, as what food was supposed to be in that context. And many of them carried those expectations into adulthood. They raised children who ate the same meals. They didn't question it because they had never been given a reason to. This wasn't about ignorance, it wasn't about negligence, it was about trust. Trust in institutions. Trust in the idea that if something was happening at scale, at the federal level, it must have been thought through, it must have been tested, it must have been safe. And, in the narrow sense, it was safe. No one was being poisoned, no one was collapsing in the cafeteria. The harm, if it existed, was subtle, cumulative. The kind of harm that doesn't show up in a single meal, but in a lifetime of meals. In a relationship with food that was built on convenience rather than connection, on uniformity rather than variety, on speed rather than care. And this relationship, once established, became incredibly difficult to change, because it wasn't just about the food itself, it was about the systems that had been built around it. The supply chains, the budgets, the training programs for cafeteria staff, the expectations of parents who had grown up on the same meals and saw no reason to demand something different, the lobbying efforts of companies whose profits depended on maintaining the status quo, the political reality that changing school lunch meant confronting powerful economic interests, and that few elected officials were willing to spend political capital on something as mundane, as everyday as cafeteria food. So the system persisted. It adapted in small ways. New guidelines were introduced, nutritional standards were updated. There were efforts in some districts to incorporate more fresh produce, to bring back on-site cooking, to move away from the most heavily processed options. But these efforts were often underfunded, inconsistent, and hampered by the same structural constraints that had created the problem in the first place. Because the infrastructure was built for processed food, the budgets were calculated around processed food. The entire logistical framework assumed processed food. Changing the food required changing everything else, and that kind of systemic change moved slowly, if it moved at all. By the 1980s, the model that had been introduced in the early 1950s had become so entrenched that it was difficult to imagine an alternative. School lunch wasn't just a meal, it was a program, an industry, a political issue. And the children eating it had no voice in the conversation. They ate what was served, adapted to what was available, and internalized the message that this was simply how things were. The consequences, when they did begin to appear, were diffuse, difficult to pin down. Childhood obesity rates began to climb. Rates of type 2 diabetes, once almost unheard of in children, began to rise. Attention and behavior issues, gut health problems, food allergies, all of these increased, and while no single cause could be identified, diet was increasingly recognized as a contributing factor. But even then, even as the data accumulated, the response was often to tweak the system rather than question it, to add a vegetable here, reduce sodium there, replace one processed item with a slightly less processed alternative. The fundamental model, the idea that school meals should be mass-produced, centrally distributed, and optimized for cost, remained largely unchallenged. And this wasn't because the people running these programs were malicious or indifferent or ignorant. It was because they were working within a system that had been designed with different priorities, a system that valued efficiency over experience, that measured success in terms of meals served, not meals enjoyed, that treated children as consumers of nutrition rather than as people learning how to eat, how to relate to food, how to nourish themselves in a way that would sustain them for the rest of their lives. The children who grew up in this system didn't have a point of comparison. They didn't know that school meals had once been different, that there had been a time when cafeterias smelled like cooking rather than reheating, when lunch ladies were cooks rather than assemblers. They accepted what they were given because they had no reason not to, and as they grew into adults, many of them replicated the same patterns. They bought convenience foods, they relied on processed meals, they raised children who expected food to be quick, uniform, and recognizable from a distance. The cycle perpetuated itself, not because anyone was making a conscious decision to continue it, but because the alternative required effort, resources, and a willingness to challenge something that had been presented from the very beginning as progress. By the time anyone thought to ask whether this model was serving children well, not just keeping them fed, but genuinely serving their long-term health, their development, their understanding of what food could be, the system was already massive, already embedded, already defended by entities with significant financial stakes in its continuation. And changing it required not just new policies, but a fundamental rethinking of what schools were supposed to provide. Whether feeding children was just about meeting caloric requirements, or whether it was about something more, something harder to measure but no less important. And that question, decades after the initial shift, still hasn't been fully answered. The system adjusted, it adapted, but the core assumptions that food should be cheap, that consistency mattered more than quality, that industrial production was the only viable path to feeding millions of children, those assumptions remained largely intact. And the children kept eating, kept adapting, kept learning what food was supposed to be from meals that had been designed not for them, but for the system that produced them. This wasn't the only change. Similar decisions followed. In food assistance programs, in hospital cafeterias, in prisons, in every institutional setting where feeding large numbers of people at low cost became the primary goal. The logic that shaped school lunch spread outward, normalized itself across multiple contexts, became so ubiquitous that questioning it felt like questioning reality itself. And by the time the consequences became undeniable, by the time the health data and the behavioral patterns and the cultural shifts were all pointing in the same direction, undoing the damage required confronting not just a policy, but an entire way of thinking about food, about children, about what institutions owe to the people they serve. That confrontation is still ongoing.